There is a war being fought right now, and most people are losing it. Not on a battlefield, not in a courtroom, not even in a boardroom, but in the quiet, invisible space between two people, where one speaks and the other listens. And here is what no one ever teaches you. The moment you open your mouth to explain yourself, you have already surrendered. Not partially, not a little, completely. Because the person who explains themselves is the person who needs to be understood. And the person who needs to be understood is the person who has already handed over their power to someone else. Let that settle for a second. Think about the last time someone came at you, questioned your decisions, doubted your character, misread your actions, and you felt this burning, almost uncontrollable urge to correct them, to clarify, to make them see the truth of who you are and why you did what you did. That urge, that burning need to be understood, is not a virtue. It is a vulnerability. And if you keep feeding it, it will cost you more than you realize. Now, before you misunderstand me, and yes, I am aware of the irony of saying that in a script about never explaining yourself, let me be precise about what I mean. This is not about being mysterious for the sake of mystery. This is not a trick to seem cool. This is not a social tactic you use at a party to seem aloof and interesting. What I am about to walk you through is something far older, far darker, and far more powerful than any surface-level manipulation tactic you have read about in a best-selling psychology book. This is about understanding the architecture of power, and how explanation, as innocent and honest as it seems, is one of the fastest ways to dismantle your own. Niccolo Machiavelli, writing in the 16th century about the nature of princes and power, said something that most people read once and never fully absorb. He said, "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." Now, most people focus on the fear versus love part of that quote. But what Machiavelli was really pointing at was something deeper. He was talking about dependency. The prince who needs his subjects to love him is dependent on their approval. He is in the truest sense at their mercy. The same principle applies here. The person who constantly explains themselves is dependent on the listener's approval, their understanding, their agreement. And that dependency, even if it is never spoken, is felt by everyone in the room. Let me tell you about a man named Marcus. Marcus was good at his job, genuinely talented. Sharp mind, strong instincts, someone who could walk into a room and read it faster than most people could tie their shoes. And for a while, he moved up the ladder quickly. But there was one thing about Marcus that quietly destroyed every room he walked into. Whenever he made a decision, he explained it. Not because anyone asked, just because he wanted to make sure everyone understood his reasoning. He thought this was a strength. He thought it showed intelligence, transparency, leadership even. What it actually showed was something he could not see. It showed that he was uncomfortable with uncertainty. It showed that he needed people to agree with him before he could feel confident in his own choices. It showed that somewhere deep inside he did not fully trust himself. And people noticed. Not consciously, not with words, but in the way influence actually travels, which is beneath the surface. In feeling, in impression. In the quiet story the room writes about you when you are not paying attention. Within 2 years, Marcus had been passed over for 3 promotions. His ideas were heard but rarely adopted. People liked him, but nobody followed him. Because followers do not follow people who explain. They follow people who decide. Now let us get into the psychology of this, because I want you to understand not just what is happening, but why it is happening at the level of the human mind. When you explain yourself, you are on a neurological level asking for validation. You might not feel like that is what you are doing. You might feel like you are simply communicating clearly, being transparent, respecting the other person's intelligence. But the brain does not care about your intentions. The brain responds to patterns, and the pattern of explanation, especially unprompted explanation, is the same pattern as appeasement. Appeasement is what lower-ranking animals do when they encounter a dominant one. They make themselves smaller. They lower their heads. They signal, "I am not a threat. Please accept me." Now, I am not saying you are an animal, but I am saying that somewhere underneath your rational mind, in the older parts of your brain that still run on ancient social instincts, explaining yourself registers the same way. It says, "I am uncertain." It says, "I need your approval." It says, "I am making myself accountable to you." And the person receiving your explanation, even if they never analyze this consciously, feels the shift. They feel themselves moving into a position of judgment. And once someone is in the position of judging you, you have already lost something that is very hard to recover. Theodore Roosevelt once said something that I have thought about for a long time. He said, in any moment of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing, the next best thing is the wrong thing, and the worst thing you can do is nothing. But there is a fourth option Roosevelt did not name, and it is worse than all three. The worst thing you can do is make the right decision, and then explain it until it sounds wrong. Think about how many times you have seen this happen. A leader makes a bold call, a clear, intelligent decision, but then they feel the room go quiet, or feel a little pushback, or sense some uncertainty in the air, and they start to fill the silence. They say things like, well, the reason I decided this is because, and I know it might seem like, and I want you to understand that I thought about it from every angle. And with every word, the decision that was once standing tall begins to slouch, because explanation introduces doubt. Even when you are explaining something correct, the act of explaining it signals that the decision needed explaining. And things that are truly powerful, truly right, truly inevitable, do not need to be explained. The sun does not explain why it rises. Let us talk about Robert Greene, because if you have read the 48 Laws of Power, you will recognize the shadow of what I am describing. Law number 9. Win through your actions, never through argument. Greene writes, and I am paraphrasing here because the full passage would take an hour on its own, that any victory you gain through argument is temporary and fragile. The person you argued with may concede in the moment, but inside they remain unconvinced, and they carry that resentment forward. But a victory through action, through demonstration, through results that speak without a single word, that victory is permanent, because it bypasses the ego of the other person entirely. It does not give them anything to resist. When you explain yourself, you are presenting an argument. Even if you do not mean it as a debate, even if you are not combative about it, you are still inviting the other person to engage with your reasoning, to poke holes in it, to weigh it, to judge it. And the moment they are weighing you, the dynamic has shifted. You are not a person of power in that moment. You are a case being considered. I want you to think about the most powerful person you have ever encountered in your life. Not the loudest, not the most aggressive, not the one with the best arguments, the most powerful. Chances are, when you imagine them, one of the first things that comes to mind is their silence. The way they did not feel the need to fill every pause. The way they looked at you when you spoke without rushing to respond. The way they made decisions and moved on without circling back to justify them. Power is not loud. Power is not busy. Power does not chase understanding, because power is comfortable with being misunderstood. This is the thing that separates real psychological dominance from the performance of it. Most people think power means being decisive, confident, assertive. And yes, those things matter. But at its core, power is about not needing approval, not needing validation, not needing anyone else's mental model of you to match your own. And the deepest, most honest signal of that not needing is the ability to let someone misunderstand you completely and simply move on. Sun Tzu, writing in The Art of War over 2,000 years ago, gave us a principle that most people apply to strategy, but almost nobody applies to their own psychology. He said, "Be extremely subtle, even to the point of formlessness. Be extremely mysterious, even to the point of soundlessness. Thereby you can be the director of the opponent's fate." The formlessness Sun Tzu was describing is not just a military tactic. It is a psychological architecture. When people cannot pin you down, cannot fully read you, cannot map your reasoning with clean precision, they instinctively assign you more weight. This is because the human brain is a pattern recognition machine. It feels safe when it can categorize things. And when it cannot, when something or someone resists easy categorization, the brain fills that gap with significance. In other words, mystery is automatically interpreted as depth, and depth is interpreted as power. But here is what destroys mystery faster than anything else. Explanation. The moment you explain your reasoning in full, the mystery collapses. The person across from you no longer has to wonder about you. They do not have to assign you significance. They have been given a map of your mind, and maps are never as impressive as the territory they represent. Now let me give you a real-world example of how this plays out in social dynamics, because I want this to be something you can actually use, not just something you find interesting. Imagine two people, both of whom have just been accused of something unfair. Maybe it is in the workplace. Maybe it is in a friendship. Maybe it is in a relationship. The specific situation does not matter. What matters is that they have both been unfairly judged, and now they have to respond. Person A immediately launches into an explanation. They lay out the timeline. They clarify the facts. They reference past behavior to establish character. They are patient, thorough, and completely reasonable. Person B looks at the person who made the accusation, holds the silence for exactly 1 beat longer than is comfortable, and says simply, "I understand you see it that way," and then they move on. Who do you believe? If you are honest with yourself, you believe person B. Not because their response was more informative, not because it addressed the accusation, not because it was more logical or more fair. You believe them because their response communicated something that person A's response, despite all its detail and sincerity, could not communicate: certainty. Person B did not scramble. They did not defend. They did not enter the emotional space of the accusation at all. They simply acknowledged it from a distance and walked on. And that kind of composure is not just impressive. It is convincing. Let me go deeper, because what I have described so far is the surface layer of this principle. The real conversation is not about how you respond to accusations or how you handle pushback. The real conversation is about identity. There is a psychological concept that Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who gave us so much of our modern language for the human shadow, called the persona. The persona is the mask we wear in social situations, the curated version of ourselves we present to the world. And what Jung understood, in ways that most people are still catching up to, is that the more desperately you try to control your persona, the more fragile it becomes, because the persona that needs to be constantly explained and defended is the persona that does not truly believe in itself. Think about it this way. If you had a deep, unshakable knowing of who you are, if you were truly rooted in your own identity, if you carried within you an absolute certainty about your values, your character, your worth, would you feel the need to explain yourself? Of course not. You would not need the other person to understand, because you would already understand. And that self-understanding, that internal clarity, would be so stable that external misunderstanding could not shake it. The need to explain is always at its root a sign that somewhere inside the explanation is really for yourself. There is a story told about the Japanese swordsman Miyamoto Musashi, who is perhaps history's greatest duelist, a man who fought over 60 duels and never once lost. Musashi had a practice that his enemies found deeply unsettling. He would arrive to duels late, sometimes hours late. And when he finally arrived, he would not explain himself. He would not apologize. He would not acknowledge the inconvenience at all. He would simply arrive and be ready to fight. Now, the conventional explanation for this is that he was psychologically destabilizing his opponents, throwing them off balance with the weight. That is true, but there is something deeper here. Musashi was demonstrating, before the first sword was drawn, that the rules of social courtesy did not apply to him the way they applied to other men. He was not rude. He was not disrespectful in the petty sense. He was operating from a completely different framework, one in which his presence, his timing, his choices were simply not subject to external judgment. And every opponent who waited for him felt that framework pressing against them, felt the silent message it carried. This man does not owe anyone an explanation. Not even me, not even now, not even here. And that realization before a single strike was already a defeat. Let us talk about relationships, because this is where I see people make the most painful mistakes with this principle. In romantic relationships especially, there is a cultural narrative, a deeply embedded belief, that explaining yourself is a form of love, that to love someone is to be fully transparent with them, to share your reasoning, to help them understand every corner of your mind. And while transparency has its place, the constant compulsion to explain every choice, every mood, every decision, to justify your emotional state, to defend your reactions, that is not love. That is anxiety, dressed up as intimacy. The healthiest relationships, the ones with the most genuine respect and the most sustainable attraction, are the ones where both people maintain a certain interior sovereignty, a space within themselves that they do not hand over to the other person's judgment. Because here is what happens when you explain every thought and feeling in a relationship. You train the other person to expect explanations, and once they expect them, they start to require them. And once they require them, you have handed them the keys to your inner life, and they will use those keys in ways you did not anticipate. Not out of malice necessarily, but because humans, when given power, use it. That is just what we do. Now, I am not saying to be cold. I am not saying to be withholding in a punishing way. I am not telling you to weaponize silence or become emotionally unavailable as a manipulation tactic. What I am telling you is something far more fundamental. Become someone who does not need to explain. because you are already enough. Because you have already done the interior work of knowing who you are and trusting that knowledge so deeply that you do not require it to be ratified by anyone else. This is what the Stoic philosophers were pointing at when they wrote about the inner citadel. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, and perhaps history's most powerful practitioner of philosophy, wrote in his Meditations, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." The inner citadel is the part of you that cannot be touched by external judgment. It is not a wall you build against the world. It is a foundation so solid that the world's opinions simply do not reach the part of you that matters. And when you live from that place, the need to explain evaporates. Not because you are suppressing it, but because it was never real to begin with. It was just fear, and fear dissolves in the presence of genuine self-knowing. There is a tactical dimension to this that I want to walk through carefully, because some of you are watching this for the specific, practical application. When you stop explaining yourself in professional environments, something interesting happens. At first, people feel slightly unsettled. They are used to you filling the silence. They are used to your reasoning being available to them on demand. And suddenly it is not, and they do not know what to do with that. Some will push harder. They will ask more direct questions, probe more aggressively, try to get you to explain by making their demand more explicit. This is the test. And the way you pass it is not by refusing to answer. That would be combative and counterproductive. The way you pass it is by answering the question that was asked. And only that question, without elaborating, without contextualizing, without justifying. Someone asks you, "Why did you make that decision?" The weak answer is a paragraph. It starts with, "Well, I considered several factors, and given the timeline and the budget constraints, I felt that the best approach would be..." The powerful answer is a sentence. "I thought it was the right call," and then silence. Let the silence sit. You will be tempted to fill it. Every social instinct you have has been trained to treat silence as a problem to be solved, as a gap to be bridged with words. Resist that. Because in that silence, something is happening that your explanation would have prevented. The other person is arriving at their own conclusion. And humans always trust their own conclusions more than conclusions that were handed to them. Think about how this applies in negotiation, which is perhaps the clearest arena for observing how explanation destroys leverage. Every experienced negotiator will tell you the same thing. The first person to speak after an offer has been made is the one who loses. Why? Because speaking means you are uncomfortable with the silence, and discomfort means you need the deal more than the other person does. And need is the single most dangerous thing you can reveal in a negotiation. But here is what most people miss. This principle extends far beyond formal negotiations. Every conversation is a negotiation of some kind. Every social interaction involves an implicit trade of status, of attention, of trust, of influence. And every time you rush to explain yourself, you are telling the other person how much of the deal you need. You are saying, "I need you to understand me, I need you to agree with me, I need you to think well of me." And once you say that, in whatever form you say it, you have already handed them something they should never have had. Epictetus, who was once a slave and became one of the most influential philosophers in history, wrote something in his Enchiridion that I think about constantly. He wrote, "Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life." What does this have to do with explanation? Everything. The desire to explain yourself is, at its root, a desire for things to be different than they are. You want the other person's perception of you to change. You want the record to be corrected. You want the situation to be different. But wisdom does not reach for different. Wisdom looks at what is, accepts it with clear eyes, and moves from there. The person who does not explain themselves is not the person who has given up on being understood. They are the person who has accepted that being understood is simply not a requirement for moving forward. And that acceptance, that release, is one of the most liberating and most powerful things a human being can practice. I want to address something that I know is sitting in the back of some of your minds. Is this not arrogant? Is there not something dismissive, even disrespectful, about refusing to explain yourself to people? And I want to answer that honestly, because it is a fair question. There is a difference between arrogance and sovereignty. Arrogance says, "I am better than you, so you do not deserve my explanation." Sovereignty says, "I know who I am, and that knowledge does not require your confirmation." Arrogance is about comparison. Sovereignty is about rootedness. The arrogant person actually needs to explain themselves more than anyone. Because their arrogance is a defense mechanism built over a deep well of insecurity. They explain themselves by dismissing others, by positioning themselves above, by performing confidence they do not feel. The sovereign person has nothing to perform. They are simply present, simply themselves. And that presence, that unhurried, undefended selfhood, is both more powerful and more respectful than any explanation could ever be, because it treats the other person as someone who can handle not being given everything, someone who has their own mind, someone who does not need to be managed or appeased. There is one more dimension I want to explore before I bring this home, and it is the dimension that most people in this space never talk about: the spiritual and philosophical cost of constant explanation. Every time you explain yourself, you are, in a very real sense, fragmenting yourself. You are breaking your experience of yourself into pieces small enough for someone else to evaluate. You are translating your inner life into the language of external judgment. And in that translation, something is always lost. There is a concept in Zen Buddhism called beginner's mind, which points to the freshness and openness of someone encountering something for the first time. And there is a related idea, less often discussed, about the cost of labeling. When we label something, when we explain it and categorize it and make it legible to another person, we freeze it. We reduce its living, moving, complex reality to a fixed description, and in doing so we often lose our own direct relationship to it. This is what happens when you explain your emotions constantly. When every feeling has to be made legible to your partner or your friends or your audience, you start to live in the explanation rather than in the feeling, and that is a kind of exile from yourself. The most psychologically rich people I have ever encountered, the ones with the deepest inner lives, the most genuine self-possession, they are not the ones with the most articulate explanations. They are the ones who have learned to live comfortably inside their own experience, without needing to translate it for anyone. Fyodor Dostoevsky, who understood the human psyche better than almost any novelist who has ever lived, wrote in Notes from Underground about the experience of being a man who over-explains himself. A man who is so consumed by the need to be understood that he has lost all capacity for direct action. The underground man, as he is known, is a figure of pure psychological paralysis. He cannot act, he cannot choose, he cannot move, because he is too busy narrating, too busy explaining, too busy translating every thought and feeling into a form that might be acceptable to some imagined judge. And reading that book, which Dostoevsky published in 1864, you recognize something that is timeless about human nature. The explaining mind is the imprisoned mind. Not because explanation is evil, but because when explanation becomes a compulsion, when it becomes the lens through which you process every experience and every relationship, it becomes the walls of a cell you built yourself. And the key to that cell, the thing that opens it, is not a better explanation. It is the willingness to step out without one. Let me bring this to a practical close, because I want you to leave here with something you can use. Starting today, here is what I want you to practice. For the next 7 days, every time you feel the impulse to explain yourself, pause. Not forever, just long enough to ask one question. Am I explaining because this person genuinely needs to understand something important? Or am I explaining because I need them to think well of me? If it is the first, speak. Clear, necessary communication is always valuable. There are moments where explanation is leadership, where it is kindness, where it is the right and honorable thing. But if the honest answer is the second, if you are explaining because you want their approval, or because you cannot tolerate being misunderstood, or because the silence makes you uncomfortable, then do not explain. Let the silence stand. Let the misunderstanding live. Let the other person form whatever conclusion they form, and trust that your actions over time will communicate everything that your words were trying to rush. Because here is the final truth of this entire conversation. People do not remember your explanations. They remember how you made them feel. They remember the presence you carried when you walked into the room. They remember whether you seemed certain or searching. They remember whether you moved like someone who needed something, or someone who already had everything they required. Your explanation, no matter how brilliant, no matter how thorough, is forgotten by the end of the day. But the feeling of being in the presence of someone who does not need to explain themselves, someone who is simply, completely, unshakably themselves, that stays, that is what people follow. That is what people trust. That is what real power looks like from the inside. Machiavelli understood this. Sun Tzu understood this. Musashi understood this. Marcus Aurelius understood this. And now, so do you. Not because I explained it to you perfectly, but because somewhere in this conversation, something in you recognized it. That recognition is not new. You have felt it before, in moments when you held your tongue and stood firm, when you let someone misunderstand you and felt beneath the discomfort a quiet kind of dignity. You already know what it feels like to not explain. You have just been trained to apologize for it. Stop apologizing. Stop explaining. Stand in the fullness of what you know, who you are, and what you have decided, and let the world catch up to you. If it does not, that is fine too, because you were never waiting for it to begin with. And with that, I want to thank you for spending this time here and actually staying until the end, because that alone tells me something about you. Most people would have scrolled past. Most people are looking for shortcuts, for quick tricks, for the 3-second technique that changes their life. But you stayed, you listened. And that patience, that willingness to sit inside a long idea and let it breathe, that is the same quality that will serve you in every area of life where real mastery lives. If this changed something in how you see yourself and how you see the dynamics around you, do me one small favor. Like this video, and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more content like this in the future, because there is so much more where this came from. Deeper layers of psychology, of philosophy, of the invisible mechanics of power and self-possession that most people will live their entire lives without ever encountering. We are just getting started.